Bobby Martinez woke up at 5:30 every morning, just like he had for the past 15 years. His small apartment above the auto repair shop was quiet, overlooking the sleepy streets of Oceanside, California. The alarm clock wasn't necessary anymore. His body had been trained long ago to wake before dawn, back when missing a wake-up call could mean the difference between life and death. He stretched his stiff joints and looked out the window at the Pacific Ocean in the distance. The water was calm today, nothing like the choppy seas he remembered from night insertions decades ago. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now. Bobby was 58, with gray streaking through his beard and deep lines around, his eyes that told stories he would never share. After a quick shower, he pulled on his usual outfit. Long-sleeved flannel shirt, even though it would be warm today. Jeans that had seen better days. Work boots that were comfortable and practical. The long sleeves weren't just for warmth. They covered the ink on his left forearm, a tattoo that he wished he could forget but never would. Bobby walked the 6 blocks to Coastal Hardware, the small store where he had worked part-time for the last 8 years. The owner, Mr. Chen, had hired him without asking too many questions. Bobby was reliable, knew his way around tools, and customers liked his quiet, helpful manner. What more did anyone need to know? The morning routine was always the same. Unlock the front door, turn on the lights, check the cash register. The store smelled like sawdust and metal, familiar scents that reminded him of building things instead of destroying them. It was honest work, simple work. Nobody shot at him here. Nobody depended on him to make split-second decisions that would determine who lived and who died. The first customer of the day was Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street. Her kitchen faucet was leaking again. Bobby helped her pick out the right washer and explained how to install it, speaking slowly and patiently. She reminded him of his own mother, who had passed away 5 years ago without ever really knowing what her son had done in the service. By 10 in the morning, the store was busier. Contractors picking up supplies, weekend warriors starting home, projects, retirees keeping themselves busy with repairs. Bobby knew most of them by now. They saw him as just another guy who had worked with his hands his whole life. A helpful man who knew the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, if only they knew. 24 years in the Navy. The first 12 were regular service, learning his trade, proving himself worthy. Then came the invitation. That changed everything. Special operations. The teams that didn't officially exist. Missions that would never make the news. Places on the map that most Americans couldn't pronounce. Bobby had been good at it. Too good, maybe. He could move through enemy territory like a ghost. He could make impossible shots in conditions that would break lesser men. He could lead a team into hell and bring them all back home. For 12 years he had been one of the elite, one of the few, one of the proud warriors who operated in the shadows, so that others could sleep safely at night. But that was before the injury that ended his career, before the nightmares that still woke him up some nights, before he realized that the skills that made him a perfect soldier made him a poor fit for normal life. The transition had been brutal. The military had offered counseling, job placement programs, disability benefits. But how do you explain to a civilian employer that your previous job involved infiltrating terrorist strongholds? How do you make small talk at office parties when your idea of a bad day at work involves people trying to kill you? So Bobby had chosen invisibility instead. He moved to this small coastal town where nobody knew him. He found simple work that didn't require background checks or detailed resumes. He kept his mouth shut about his past and tried to blend in with the regular folks who had lived normal lives with normal problems. Most days it worked. He could go entire weeks without thinking about the weight of a rifle in his hands or the sound of helicopters in the night. He could focus on helping customers find the right bolt or explaining how to fix a squeaky door hinge, small problems with simple solutions. But the tattoo was always there, hidden under his sleeve like a secret he couldn't erase. He had gotten it after his most successful mission, back when he was young and proud, and thought the ink would be a badge of honor he would wear forever. Now it felt more like a brand, marking him as something he used to be but could never be again. The design was unique, something that only a handful of men in the world would recognize. A skull with crossed weapons underneath, and above it, words, in a language that most Americans couldn't read. It represented a brotherhood forged in blood and fire, a bond between men who had shared experiences that civilian life could never match. Sometimes, late at night when the store was closed and the town was asleep, Bobby would roll up his sleeve and look at the tattoo in the bathroom mirror. The ink had faded over the years, but the meaning hadn't. It reminded him of who he used to be, of the men he had served with, of missions accomplished and brothers lost. Most of those men were gone now. Some had died in combat, their names carved into black granite walls that civilians visited on holidays. Others had struggled with the transition to civilian life and lost battles with demons that couldn't be fought with conventional weapons. A few had simply disappeared like Bobby, choosing anonymity over recognition. Bobby often wondered if any of them were still out there, stocking shelves or driving trucks or teaching school in small towns where nobody asked questions about their past. Did they wake up at dawn out of habit? Did they still check their six when walking into crowded places? Did they still feel like strangers in their own country? The loneliness was the worst part, not the physical loneliness of living alone, but the deeper isolation that came from carrying secrets that could never be shared. Bobby could talk to his customers about the weather or the local football team, but he could never tell them about the time he spent 3 days behind enemy lines with a bullet in his leg, calling in airstrikes that saved hundreds of lives. He couldn't explain why he always sat with his back to the wall in restaurants, or why loud noises sometimes made him tense up, or why he had never married because he was afraid of bringing his darkness into someone else's light. By noon, the lunch rush had died down and Bobby was restocking shelves in the back of the store. The work was mindless, repetitive, soothing in its simplicity. Screws went in one bin, washers in another, nuts and bolts organized by size and function. Everything in its proper place, everything accounted for. He was reaching for a box on a high shelf when he heard the bell above the front door chime. Another customer, probably looking for something simple. Bobby didn't bother turning around immediately. He would finish this task first, then go help whoever had wandered in. But something felt different this time. Call it instinct, call it paranoia, call it the sixth sense that had kept him alive in places where being careless meant being dead. Someone was watching him, studying him with more attention than the average hardware store customer. Bobby's hand paused on the box he was reaching for. After 15 years of anonymity, after countless interactions with customers who saw him as just another helpful clerk, someone was looking at him with eyes that might recognize what they saw. The moment he had always feared might be about to arrive. Jake Thompson had been back from deployment for exactly 37 days, but who was counting? Actually, he was. Every morning when he woke up in his girlfriend's apartment, he felt the strange disconnect that came with switching from the intensity of combat operations to the quiet suburban life of Oceanside, California. At 24, Jake was everything a Navy SEAL was supposed to be. 6 feet tall, lean muscle built from years of punishment, eyes that missed nothing, and a mind that had been sharpened by the best military training in the world. His hands were calloused from rope work and weapons handling, his body marked, with small scars that told stories he rarely shared even with Lisa. Lisa Chen was trying her best to help him readjust. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital and understood better than most that warriors needed time to decompress. Her family had welcomed Jake with open arms, treating him like the son they never had. Today was supposed to be a relaxing Saturday, helping Lisa's father build a new deck behind their house, but Jake was having trouble with relaxation. His mind kept wandering back to the compound in Syria where his team had spent 2 weeks hunting high-value targets. The successful mission had saved American lives, but it had also cost them. Rodriguez hadn't made it home. Neither had Williams. 2 good men, 2 empty seats on the transport plane, 2 families that would never be whole again. The nightmares were getting better, but they hadn't stopped completely. Last night he had dreamed about the firefight again, the one where he had to make a choice between saving ammunition and saving lives. In the dream, he made the wrong choice. In real life, he had made the right one, but the weight of that decision still sat heavy in his chest. Lisa's father, Mr. Chen, was a kind man who had emigrated from Taiwan 30 years ago and built a successful accounting business. He treated Jake with respect and never asked direct questions about his service, though Jake could see the curiosity in his eyes. Most civilians wanted to know about the exciting parts, the movie stuff. They didn't want to hear about the boredom, the fear, the way your hands shake after the adrenaline wears off. "We need more screws," Mr. Chen announced, looking at the pile of lumber they had been working with all morning. "The ones I bought yesterday are too short for these thick boards." Jake nodded, grateful for the distraction. Physical work helped quiet his mind. Building something instead of destroying it felt like progress. "I'll run to the hardware store. You want me to grab anything else while I'm there?" "Maybe some wood stain samples. Lisa's mother wants to see what colors we have to choose from." The drive to Coastal Hardware took less than 10 minutes, but Jake found himself taking the long way. He wasn't ready to be around people yet, wasn't ready for small talk with strangers who would see his military bearing and either thank him for his service or ask questions he couldn't answer. Some days the attention felt heavy, like wearing a uniform that didn't quite fit anymore. The hardware store was busy for a Saturday afternoon. Families working on weekend projects, contractors picking up supplies, the usual mix of people who kept small businesses alive. Jake parked his truck and took a deep breath before going inside. Crowd still made him nervous. Too many variables, too many potential threats. His therapist called it hypervigilance. Jake called it staying alive. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Jake automatically scanned the room. 2 exits, including the one he just came through. Clear sight lines to most of the store. Several customers browsing the aisles, none of them paying attention to him. An older man behind the counter, helping a woman choose between different types of light bulbs. Jake grabbed a shopping basket and headed toward the fasteners section. The familiar smell of metal and wood brought back memories of his grandfather's workshop, where he had learned to use tools as a boy. Those were simpler times when the biggest decision was whether to use a nail or a screw, when problems had clear solutions and right answers. He found the screws he needed quickly, but as he was comparing different lengths, something caught his attention. The man behind the counter moved with a certain economy of motion that Jake recognized. Not the shuffling gait of most civilians, but the purposeful movement of someone who had been trained to waste no energy, to always be ready for action. Jake watched him discreetly while pretending to read the specifications on a package of wood screws. The man was probably in his late 50s, gray beard, weathered hands that looked like they had seen hard use. There was something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders, that reminded Jake of the older operators he had served with. The guys who had done multiple deployments, who had seen things that aged them beyond their years. But that was crazy, right? Oceanside was full of military retirees. Camp Pendleton was just down the road. Half the men in this town probably had some kind of service background. Jake was seeing patterns that weren't there, connections that existed only in his imagination. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this man was different. There was something in his eyes, an alertness that never quite went away, that reminded Jake of his own team leaders. The ones who had kept them alive by seeing threats before they materialized, by making decisions that saved lives. Jake moved closer to the counter, still pretending to shop but really studying the man. He was helping a customer choose the right drill bits, explaining the differences between materials with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed helping people solve problems. But Jake noticed other things too. How the man's eyes briefly scanned the store every few minutes. How he positioned himself so he could see both the front door and the back exit. How his body language suggested he was ready to move quickly if necessary. These were habits that didn't develop from selling hardware. These were the habits of someone who had spent years in situations where situational awareness meant survival. The customer finished his purchase and left, and Jake found himself walking toward the counter with a package of screws he didn't really need to buy. The man looked up as he approached, and for just a moment their eyes met. Jake felt a jolt of recognition, not of the man's face, but of something deeper. The look of someone who had seen combat, who had made hard choices, who carried the weight of experiences that couldn't be shared with civilians. "Find everything you need?" the man asked, his voice carrying just a hint of authority that suggested he was used to being listened to. Yes, sir, Jake replied automatically, then caught himself. He didn't usually call store clerks sir, but something about this man commanded that kind of respect. As the man rang up the screws, Jake noticed his hands. They were steady, precise, but marked with small scars that looked like they came from more than just hardware store accidents. And when he reached across the counter to hand Jake his change, his sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing just a glimpse of what looked like a tattoo on his forearm. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had only seen the edge of it, just a partial view of what looked like ink, but something about the design made his heart race. It wasn't a typical military tattoo, not the kind that regular sailors or Marines got. This looked different, more specific, more exclusive. The man quickly pulled his sleeve back down, but it was too late. Jake had seen enough to know that this wasn't just any veteran working at a hardware store. This was someone who had operated at a level that most people would never know existed. Someone whose service had been so classified, so dangerous that he had chosen to disappear rather than seek recognition. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what he had just seen. The stories he had heard from the older guys, the legends about operators who had done things that would never make it into history books. Men who had saved lives and changed the course of conflicts through missions that officially never happened. Could he be looking at one of those ghosts? One of the men who had paved the way for operators like Jake, who had set the standards and established the traditions that still guided the teams today? The man was looking at him strangely now, probably wondering why Jake was staring instead of leaving with his purchase. But Jake couldn't move. He was standing 3 feet away from what might be living history, a man whose experiences could teach him things that no training manual could ever contain. The question was, what should he do about it? Jake stood frozen at the counter, his heart pounding so hard he was sure the older man could hear it. The partial glimpse of that tattoo had triggered something deep in his memory, something from a classified briefing he had attended just 6 months ago at the Naval Special Warfare Command. The briefing had been about operational history, lessons learned from previous generations of operators. The instructor, a grizzled master chief with 30 years of service, had shown them photos and documents that most people would never see. Stories of missions that had shaped modern special operations, tactics that were still being used today, men who had set the standards that current SEALs lived up to. One particular slide had stuck with Jake. It showed a grainy photograph of 12 men standing in front of a helicopter somewhere in the desert. Their faces were blacked out for security reasons, but the instructor had explained that these operators had conducted some of the most dangerous rescue missions of the 1990s. Hostage situations, terrorist strongholds, impossible odds overcome, through skill and courage. But what had really caught Jake's attention was the tattoo visible on one man's arm in the photo. The image was partially obscured, but Jake could make out distinctive elements. A skull design with crossed weapons underneath, and what looked like foreign text above it. The instructor had mentioned that this particular group had their own informal insignia, something that identified them as part of an exclusive brotherhood. Most of these men didn't survive, the Master Chief had said quietly. The ones who did, well, let's just say they earned the right to disappear if they wanted to. Their service was so classified that even their families don't know the full story of what they accomplished. Now, standing in this small hardware store, Jake was almost certain he had just seen that same tattoo design. The skull, the crossed weapons, even the positioning on the forearm matched what he remembered from the briefing. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The chances of randomly encountering one of those legendary operators in a civilian setting had to be astronomical. The man behind the counter was studying Jake with increasing intensity. Those sharp eyes were taking in details that most people would miss. Jake's military bearing, the way he stood with his weight balanced and ready to move. The telltale tan line on his wrist where a tactical watch usually sat. The small scar on his knuckles from hand-to-hand combat training. You military? The man asked casually, but Jake caught the undercurrent of something else in his voice. Assessment. Evaluation. The kind of careful probing that experienced operators use to determine if someone was friend or foe. Navy, Jake replied, keeping his answer short. In the special operations community, you didn't volunteer information unless you were sure about who you were talking to. The man nodded slowly. What rate? This was getting interesting. Asking about someone's rate was military insider knowledge. Civilians usually asked about rank or job title, but rates were Navy-specific terminology. This man knew exactly what he was asking. Special operations, Jake said carefully. He wasn't about to reveal his exact unit to a stranger, but he was curious to see how this conversation would develop. Something shifted in the older man's expression. The polite customer service mask slipped just slightly, revealing something harder underneath. Years of command, perhaps. Decisions made under pressure. The weight of responsibility that came with leading men into combat. Team? The man asked. And now Jake was certain this wasn't just casual conversation. This was one operator probing another, using the kind of shorthand that only people in the community would understand. Jake hesitated. His training told him to be cautious, to reveal nothing that could compromise operational security. But something about this man felt familiar, trustworthy in a way that went beyond normal civilian interactions. Still, he decided to deflect rather than answer directly. You ask a lot of questions for someone who sells screws and hammers, Jake said with a slight smile. The man actually chuckled at that, a sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did Jake. Old habits, he said. Once you've been responsible for keeping people alive, you tend to stay curious about who you're talking to. There it was. The admission that this man had seen combat, had been in leadership positions where other people's lives depended on his decisions. Jake felt his pulse quicken as the pieces started falling into place. How long you been out? Jake asked, turning the questioning around. 15 years, the man replied. Gave 24 to the Navy, then decided it was time to find a quieter way to serve. 24 years. That timeline fit perfectly with what Jake remembered from the briefing. The elite unit he was thinking of had been most active in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which would put their retirement right around 15 years ago. Jake's mind was racing now, trying to figure out how to confirm his suspicions without revealing classified information or putting either of them in an awkward position. He couldn't just ask if the man had been part of a top-secret unit. That kind of information was protected for good reasons. But as he stood there weighing his options, the man reached across the counter to straighten a display of keychains, and his sleeve pulled back again. This time, Jake got a much clearer view of the tattoo, and what he saw made his blood run cold. It was exactly what he had seen in that classified briefing. The skull was more detailed than he had initially realized, with empty eye sockets that seemed to stare back at him. The crossed weapons underneath were clearly visible now. Not just any weapons, but specific ones that Jake recognized as the preferred equipment of elite operators. And above it all, in script that Jake now realized was Arabic, were words that he couldn't read but somehow understood the significance of. This wasn't just any military tattoo. This was the mark of a ghost, a man who had operated at the highest levels of classified operations and then vanished into civilian life. Jake was looking at someone who had probably saved more lives than would ever be officially recorded, someone whose missions had prevented disasters that the American public would never know about. The man noticed Jake staring at his tattoo and quickly pulled his sleeve back down, but it was too late. Their eyes met across the counter, and Jake saw recognition there. Not just the acknowledgement that Jake had seen the tattoo, but the understanding that Jake knew what it meant. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hardware store continued, its normal Saturday business around them, customers browsing the aisles, cash registers ringing up sales, the mundane sounds of civilian life carrying on as if nothing extraordinary was happening. But Jake felt like he was standing at the center of a storm, faced with the decision that would affect both of their lives. Should he say something? Should he acknowledge what he had seen, what he suspected? The man had clearly chosen anonymity for a reason. 15 years of quiet civilian life suggested that he didn't want to be recognized, didn't want his past to intrude on his present. But Jake also knew that men like this often carried their burdens alone, cut off from the brotherhood that had once sustained them. The transition from elite warrior to civilian life was hard enough for regular military personnel. For someone who had operated at the highest levels of classified operations, the isolation must be overwhelming. The man was watching Jake carefully, now probably trying to determine what the young SEAL would do with this knowledge. Would he respect the older man's privacy and walk away? Would he push for confirmation of what he suspected? Or would he find some middle ground, some way to acknowledge their shared profession without crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed? Jake made his decision. He looked directly into the man's eyes and spoke just loud enough for him to hear, using words that would mean nothing to civilian ears but everything to a fellow operator. "Thank you for your service, Master Chief," he said quietly. "Especially the service that nobody knows about." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The man's entire body went rigid, his eyes widening in shock and something that might have been fear. For 15 years he had successfully hidden in plain sight, and now a young SEAL had identified him with just a few words. The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications. Jake had just acknowledged that he knew who he was talking to, or at least what he was talking to. The question now was what would happen next. The silence between them stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Bobby's hand instinctively moved to cover his tattoo, but Jake had already seen everything he needed to see. The young SEAL's words hung in the air like a challenge, an acknowledgement, and a question all rolled into one. Bobby's mind raced through 15 years of carefully constructed anonymity, all potentially shattered by a chance encounter with someone who understood the significance of faded ink on an old man's arm. His first instinct was denial, deflection, the kind of misdirection that had kept him alive during operations and invisible during retirement. "I think you've got me confused with someone else, son," Bobby said, but his voice lacked conviction. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Jake didn't back down. Instead, he leaned slightly closer to the counter, lowering his voice so that only Bobby could hear. "Operation Sandstorm, Somalia, 1998. 23 hostages extracted from a compound that intelligence said was impossible to breach. 0 friendly casualties. Complete mission success." Bobby felt the blood drain from his face. That operation was so classified that even the families of the rescued hostages didn't know the full details. The official reports listed it as a joint task force operation, with multiple agencies taking credit. The men who had actually carried out the rescue were never named, never acknowledged, never celebrated. How could this young man possibly know those specifics? The compound was a former school building, 3 stories, surrounded by concrete walls, topped with razor wire. Jake continued, his voice steady but respectful. Intelligence estimated 40 to 50 hostile fighters inside, armed with automatic weapons and RPGs. Conventional assault would have resulted in massive hostage casualties. Bobby's hands were shaking now, just slightly, but enough that he had to grip the edge of the counter to steady himself. These weren't details that appeared in any public record. This was mission-specific intelligence that only the operators and their direct command structure would have known. So instead of a frontal assault, the team went in silent, Jake pressed on. Through the sewage system, up through the basement floor by floor. 18 hours inside enemy territory, moving like ghosts, eliminating threats without alerting. The main force. By the time the hostiles realized what was happening, all 23 captives were already en route to the extraction point. Bobby closed his eyes briefly, and suddenly he was back there. The smell of sewage and cordite, the weight of his gear, the sound of his own breathing inside his mask. The face of the little girl they had found in the basement, maybe 8 years, old, too terrified to cry, the way she had held his hand as they moved through the darkness toward safety. The team leader went by the call sign Nomad 6, Jake said quietly. He stayed behind to ensure the extraction was successful, held off a counterattack with just 2 other operators until air support could level the compound. The official report listed all personnel as unidentified special operations forces. But the men who train us today still tell that stories as an example of perfect mission execution. Bobby opened his eyes and stared at the young man across the counter. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Petty Officer First Class. Jake Thompson, SEAL." "Team 3, Jake replied, straightening slightly. "And you're Master Chief Robert Martinez, Call sign Nomad 6, formerly of SEAL Team 6. The man who wrote the book on hostage rescue operations that they still use to train operators today. The words hit Bobby like physical blows. His real name, his rank, his call sign, information that he thought had been buried so deep that it would never surface again. But here was this young warrior reciting his history like he was reading from a case study. How? Bobby managed to ask. Advanced operations course at Little Creek 6 months ago, Jake explained. They showed us case studies of successful missions, tactics that are still relevant today. Your Somalia operation was the gold standard for small unit tactics in urban environments. They didn't use names or faces, but they showed enough details for someone who knew what they were looking at to piece things together. Bobby felt like the floor was shifting under his feet. For 15 years, he had believed that his service was locked away in classified files that would never see daylight. He had convinced himself that his sacrifices, his team's sacrifices, were meaningless outside of the immediate lives they had saved. The instructor was Master Chief Williams. Jake continued. He said that the operators from that era set standards that current SEALs still aspire to reach. He said that men like you proved what was possible when training, courage, and leadership came together under impossible circumstances. Williams. Bobby remembered him as a young petty officer, eager and talented, but still learning the difference between bravery and recklessness. Now he was training the next generation, passing down lessons written in blood and experience. Williams made it sound like you guys were legends, Jake said. Like you were the best of the best, operating at a level that most of us can only dream about. But he also said that most of those operators didn't survive long enough to enjoy their retirement. The few who did earned the right to disappear if they wanted to. Bobby looked around the hardware store, at the mundane reality of his civilian life. Screws and washers, paint cans and garden hoses. Such a far cry from the world he used to inhabit, where decisions were measured in seconds and mistakes were measured in lives lost. So why are you telling me this? Bobby asked. If you know who I am, you know I chose this life for a reason. I walked away from all of that. Jake was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Because I think you walked away from more than just the operations, he finally said. I think you walked away from the Brotherhood too. And maybe that wasn't necessary. You don't understand, Bobby said, his voice thick with emotion he had kept buried for years. The things we did, the places we went, the choices we made, they don't translate to civilian life. I couldn't come home and talk about my day at the office. Couldn't explain why I woke up screaming. Couldn't justify why I needed to check every room before I could sleep. So you decided to carry it all alone, Jake said. It was easier that way. Cleaner. Nobody got hurt by my problems. Jake leaned back slightly, studying Bobby's face. But you did get hurt. You isolated yourself from the only people who could understand what you've been through. You convinced yourself that your service didn't matter because nobody could acknowledge it publicly. Bobby felt tears threatening for the first time in years. This young man, this stranger who had somehow become not a stranger, was cutting right to the heart of everything Bobby had spent 15 years trying to ignore. There are others like you, Jake said gently. Operators from your generation who made it home but never really came back. They're out there, working normal jobs, keeping their heads down, thinking they're forgotten. But they're not forgotten. Every mission we run, every tactic we use, every life we save, it's built on the foundation that you and your teammates laid. Rodriguez didn't make it home, Bobby said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Neither did Chen or Williams or half a dozen others. They died so that those hostages could live, and nobody even knows their names. I know their names, Jake said quietly. We all do. They're carved into the memorial wall at Dam Neck. Their sacrifice is remembered, even if their stories can't be told publicly. Bobby had never been to that memorial. He had been too afraid that seeing those names would break something inside him that he had worked hard to keep intact. The thing is, Master Chief, Jake continued, your war isn't over. It just changed. Theaters. Those young SEALs coming up through training, they need what you learned. Not just the tactics and techniques, but the wisdom that comes from having been there and done that and somehow made it home. Bobby looked at this young man who, had somehow managed to find him after 15 years of hiding in plain sight. Jake Thompson represented everything Bobby used to be: confident, dedicated, willing to put his life on the line for others. But Bobby could also see something else in Jake's eyes, something familiar: the weight of recent combat, the struggle to reconcile the warrior identity with civilian expectations, the loneliness that came from carrying experiences that couldn't be shared with people who had never faced life and death decisions. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe Bobby's mission wasn't over after all. Bobby stared at Jake for a long moment, processing everything that had just happened. 15 years of carefully built walls had come crashing down in the span of a single conversation, but instead of feeling exposed and vulnerable, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Understood. You know, Bobby said slowly, I used to think that the hardest part of the job was the missions themselves. The planning, the execution, the split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. But I was wrong. Jake waited patiently, sensing that Bobby needed to work through whatever he was feeling. The hardest part was coming home and pretending to be normal, Bobby continued, trying to care about traffic jams and grocery shopping and whether the lawn needed mowing when you've seen what real problems look like. When you've held dying men in your arms and promised their mothers you'd bring them home safe. How do you handle it? Jake asked quietly. The transition, I mean, because I'm struggling with it myself. Bobby looked at this young warrior with new eyes. Here was someone who understood the weight of command, the responsibility that came with leading men into danger, the guilt that followed you home even after successful missions. Someone who knew what it felt like to make decisions that would haunt your dreams for years to come. Honestly, I didn't handle it well, Bobby admitted. I isolated myself, convinced myself that staying away from the community was protecting everyone else from my problems. I thought I was being noble, taking my pain and keeping it to myself, but really I was just being selfish. How is that selfish? Because I had knowledge that could help people like you, Bobby said. Experience that could save lives, lessons learned through trial and error that didn't need to be learned again the hard way. Instead of sharing what I knew, I hid in this store and pretended that my past didn't exist. The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered, and both men automatically glanced toward the sound. An elderly woman looking for garden supplies, nothing threatening, but Jake noticed how naturally Bobby had assessed the situation, how quickly he had determined there was no danger. Some habits never died. Mrs. Patterson, how can I help you today? Bobby called out cheerfully, switching instantly back into his customer service persona. But Jake could see the difference now, could recognize the performance for what it was. The woman needed help choosing fertilizer for her roses, and Bobby assisted her with the same patience and knowledge he had shown every customer Jake had observed. But now Jake understood that this man helping suburban gardeners was the same person who had once planned and executed missions that saved lives on an international scale. After Mrs. Patterson left with her purchases, Bobby turned back to Jake. You asked how I handle it, he said. The truth is, I don't think you ever really handle it completely. You just learn to carry it better. What do you mean? The memories, the guilt, the sense that you're living in two different worlds, that stuff doesn't go away, but maybe it's not supposed to. Maybe it's the price we pay for having been trusted with that kind of responsibility. Bobby paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. The question is whether you're going to let it destroy you or whether you're going to find a way to make it meaningful. Jake nodded slowly. This was exactly the kind of conversation he needed. The kind of perspective that only came from someone who had walked the same path and somehow found their way through it. Can I ask you something? Jake said. Do you ever regret it? The service, the sacrifices, the things you had to give up. Bobby was quiet for a long time, and Jake worried that he had pushed too far, asked something too personal. Every day, Bobby finally said, but not for the reasons you might think. I don't regret the missions or the danger, or even the friends I lost. Those things had meaning. They served a purpose bigger than any of us individually. What I regret is the time I wasted afterward. The years I spent convincing myself that none of it mattered because nobody could know about it. But you helped people here too, Jake pointed out. Mrs. Patterson, all the customers who come in, here looking for solutions to their problems. That has value. It does, Bobby agreed. But it's not the same as using everything you've learned to help the people who are still carrying the mission forward. When I retired, I took all my experience and locked it away like it was classified information. But experience isn't meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be shared. Jake felt something shift inside him, a sense of possibility that he hadn't felt since returning from deployment. What if we changed that? What do you mean? What if you started sharing that experience? Not publicly, not in ways that would compromise security, but with the people who could benefit from it. Young operators who are where you used to be. Guys like me who are struggling with the transition. Bobby looked skeptical. I've been out of the game for 15 years. Tactics have changed. Technology has evolved. What could I possibly teach? Current operators? Everything, Jake said emphatically. The tactical stuff might be different, but the human element hasn't changed. Leadership under pressure, making decisions with incomplete information, carrying the weight of other people's lives. Those challenges are exactly the same as they were 20 years ago. The idea was taking shape in Jake's mind as he spoke. There are informal networks, guys who get together to talk through their experiences. Nothing official, nothing that would violate security protocols, just warriors helping warriors. You could be part of that. I don't know, Bobby said, but Jake could hear the interest in his voice. Think about it, Jake pressed. How many young SEALs are out there right now struggling with the same isolation you felt? How many of them could benefit from hearing that they're not alone, that what they're going through is normal, that there's a way forward? Bobby was quiet and Jake could see him wrestling with the idea. 15 years of carefully maintained anonymity wasn't something you gave up lightly. It doesn't have to be a big thing, Jake continued. Start small, maybe just one conversation, with one person who needs to hear what you have to say. See how it feels. And if it feels wrong, then you go back to selling hardware and nobody's worse off than they were before. But if it feels right... Bobby looked around the store that had been his refuge for so many years. The familiar sights and sounds that had helped him forget who he used to be. But maybe forgetting wasn't the answer. Maybe remembering and helping others remember was the real mission. You know what the hardest part about retiring was? Bobby said suddenly. What? Losing my sense of purpose. For 24 years I knew exactly why I got up every morning. I had a mission, a team that depended on me, a clear understanding of how my actions contributed to something bigger than myself. When that ended, I felt lost. Jake nodded. I get that. Even on leave, I feel like I'm drifting, like nothing I do here matters as much as what we do downrange. But what if that's not true? Bobby said, his voice gaining strength. What if the mission just changed? What if instead of protecting people by eliminating threats overseas, we protect them by making sure the next generation of operators is better prepared, better supported, better equipped to handle the challenges they'll face? The transformation in Bobby was visible. The defeated resignation that had marked his posture for years was being replaced by something Jake recognized. The bearing of a warrior who had found his purpose again. Tell me about this informal network, Bobby said. Jake smiled. It's not complicated. Just guys getting together, sharing experiences, looking out for each other. Some are active duty, some are retired, some are transitioning between the two. The only requirement is that you've been there and done that, and you're willing to help others who are going through the same thing. And you think I'd fit in? Master Chief, you wouldn't just fit in. You'd be exactly what that group needs. Someone who's been where they are and found a way through it. Someone who can show them that there's life after the teams, that their service has meaning, even when it can't be publicly acknowledged. Bobby pulled out his phone, an old model that he had probably been using for years. What's your number? As they exchanged contact information, Jake felt like he was witnessing a resurrection. The man standing across from him wasn't just Bobby the hardware store clerk anymore. He was Master Chief Martinez, call sign Nomad 6, a warrior whose mission was just beginning a new phase. "There's a gathering next weekend," Jake said. "Nothing formal, just some guys getting together to talk. You interested?" Bobby looked at his phone, where Jake's number was now stored next to the handful of contacts he had accumulated over 15 years of civilian life. For the first time in years, he was thinking about the future, instead of trying to forget the past. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I am." The bell above the door chimed again as Jake prepared to leave, but this time, both men barely noticed. They were already planning for something bigger than hardware sales and weekend projects. They were planning for the continuation of a mission that had never really ended, just changed form. As Jake walked toward the door, Bobby called after him. "Hey, Thompson." Jake turned back. "Thank you," Bobby said simply. "For seeing me, for remembering, for giving me a chance to matter again." Jake nodded.